I'm John Shoven. I used to run SIEPR long time ago. I'm going to slightly change the name of the session to the present and future of college athletics. And for those of you who don't know, but I can't hide it, I'm nearly blind, so but I'm still getting by. Okay, so the present and future of college athletics, and I would say things are changing so fast in college athletics, and some of you know the major changes. Some of you know that, for instance, athletes now, student athletes, can transfer to a different school and a different team every year. So your players are constant free agents. Another thing you probably know is that many players are getting paid. And they're getting paid ostensibly for their use of their name and their image and their likeness. And I'm sure you know that. But there are some things you don't know that you'll learn here, I hope. A third thing that's happened, of course, was we've had these dramatic realignments of the leagues. And for instance, Stanford is in the Atlantic Coast Conference, which seems a little bit interesting. The Big Ten, which used to be a Midwestern conference, has 18 teams in it ranging from coast to coast. And only in some sense the SEC has kind of kept its regional definition, at least a little bit. Now, some of the things you don't know about that we're going to try to get you up to speed on, there's something called the House Settlement. And my guess is many of you haven't heard of it. In fact, I only heard of it maybe a month ago, and I mistakenly thought for a minute that House referred to the House of Representatives. It doesn't. It refers to a swimmer who's about 26 now, maybe 27, who swam for Arizona State and was the lead plaintiff in a lawsuit, antitrust lawsuit, it was called House versus NCAA. And there are other things called collectives that you may not know about, and maybe you'll know more about by the end. But and the other thing I think is when I say the present and future, that implies that all the change is not over. And I don't think it is. This is not an equilibrium situation, I don't think. Maybe the panelists will have some views on that. But so one question is, where are we going with this? Now we have, actually, Tara said, this is your starting five. And that's kind of a basketball term. I called it an all-star team, but we have an amazing team. And since their bios are in your program, I'll be quick, and I'll start with Roger. Roger is a longtime Stanford economist, leading industrial organization economist, wrote over 300 articles in his career. But he's probably here because he's considered the father, or maybe the godfather, of sports economics. He's the leading sports economist in the country, maybe the world. He himself did play basketball at, of all places, Caltech. And another interesting thing is he is still playing basketball. And so there you go. Tara, you may know, at the time of her retirement, she had won more games as a coach than any other basketball coach in history, men or women. 1,216 wins, and she took a year off to win a gold medal. And I didn't even think that was her most impressive accomplishment. I thought her most impressive accomplishment was to be named Pac-12 Coach of the Year, not 5 times, not 10 times, not 15 times, 18 times she won Coach of the Year. And I asked her what she thought her most rewarding aspect of coaching was, and she said, becoming friends, lifetime friends with her players. Andrew Luck, I mean, what could I say there? He's now the general manager of Stanford football, the first general manager of Stanford football. I think it's safe to say he was the greatest Stanford quarterback in more than a generation. He was the first overall pick in the NFL. He went on to have a distinguished NFL career. And I just wanted to point out that he has 2 Stanford degrees in architectural engineering and now a master's degree from our School of Education. So he's a true student athlete, or was a true student athlete. Excellent at both aspects. Nia Harrison, first of all, also an amazing student athlete, a bioengineering major, somebody who made the honor roll all 4 years when she was here and when she was starring for our soccer team. And she's now transitioning to the National Women's Soccer League, the professional league in the United States, and she's playing international soccer for the Philippines national team. So we have another brilliant scholar. She also was a named plaintiff in the aforementioned House versus NCAA lawsuit. So we'll get her views on that. And then Gene Sykes, he's been at Goldman Sachs for 40 years. And he is the co-chair of their M&A, global M&A practice. And he's also the co-chair of their technology, media, and communications practice. So he's got a very distinguished career in the investment banking industry, but that's not why he's here. He's here probably because he was leading the effort to bring the Olympics to Los Angeles, and he's been leading that for 10 years, and it's successful. Initially, it was the LA 2024 Olympics. The International Olympic Committee had bids from other places, including Paris, and they couldn't decide, so they said both Paris and Los Angeles are winning, and Paris will go in 24 and Los Angeles in 28. So he succeeded in landing the Olympics and the Para-Olympics for 2028. Quite a challenge. And of course, he himself was an athlete. He was on the lightweight varsity crew team at Harvard, which had a distinguished record. And then he is, in addition to that, a long-distance runner, a cyclist, a triathlete, and a golfer. So he brings a lot to the table. So we have a great panel, and here's your starting 5. Okay. So I'm going to start with Roger, and my argument is that you guys know, or many of you know, a little bit about the transfer portal and the payments and the league realignment, but you don't know about the House settlement and maybe some other terms that Roger's going to clarify. So Roger, could you start off with the House settlement and what other terms that they need to know to understand the rest of the discussion?
Sure. The bottom line to it is the following. The NCAA has been in constant litigation over its rules regarding caps on the compensation of athletes since 2006. When Jason White, a Stanford football player and the president of the Pac-12 Football Players Association, which was not a union, it was a federal society, when he sued, he led a class action lawsuit against the NCAA over scholarship caps. Each of these cases subsequently has been followed instantaneously by another. That is to say, antitrust suit number N+1 gets filed on the day antitrust suit number N ends. So the NCAA has been for 20 years in a constant state of litigation. The House is just the current way station, and there's more antitrust suits lining up behind it. And that's why we're in a state of chaos. Now let me answer John's question specifically about words you need to know. Words you need to know are, first, collective, because a collective means the first recognized legitimate entity to organize name, image, and likeness sales for athletes, but it has to be independent of a university, all right? So that's what a collective is. The House settlement would somewhat change those rules in that it would enable colleges to act as the collective agents for their students and indeed act as their NIL agents, all right, if it were to be adopted. So that's the first word you need to know. Then, of course, John said the other names, images, and likenesses, but interestingly enough, none of the case that was about names, images, and likenesses was the one that followed White, which is O'Bannon. Ed O'Bannon was the power forward for the UCLA when they won the national championship in the mid-1990s, and he saw himself being portrayed in an electronics game and wondered why he was in the game when he hadn't authorized it, and that led to a class action lawsuit. The result of that lawsuit was to change the cap on total scholarships, to move them from what was then an NCAA rule, that what's allowed and what isn't, to being cost of attendance, which is another term you need to know, which is an official regulated concept. Every university is required to publish in its catalog its cost of attendance, which is the best estimate of what it would cost you to attend this university for a year. And that includes a bunch of things that the NCAA previously didn't allow. The next thing you need to know is incidental to participation. One of the issues in all these cases has been, are we making college sports professionalized? And the answer to that is always no, except the NCAA, about 15 years ago, allowed compensation incidental to participation. What that means in shorthand is, if your team makes the Final Four, you get $3,500. All right, if your team is in the finals of the football playoffs, they get $3,500, all right? That was a major issue in the recent antitrust case, Alston and House, because that's pay for play. That's professionalization. That's getting, no matter how incidental the participation payment is, it's still pay for play. Finally, we have another element of the House settlement. The House settlement is based on the premise that we should treat the budgets of departments of athletics like the budgets of an NFL team. That is to say, we will set a percentage of total revenue for sports at a college, namely 51% of all the revenue from all sports, as the cap on the total amount you can pay the players across all sports. And this is sort of like the collective bargaining agreements in football and basketball, where players get a percentage of revenues. It's different because the settlement has two features to it that are different from the pros. The first is it doesn't count a whole bunch of streams of revenue that would be counted, and we won't bother with that because that's twiddling with details. The part that's really important is that it combines all sports together. That is to say, it says that the sum of all payments to football players, plus men's basketball, plus women's basketball, plus men's and women's volleyball, plus tennis, plus all other of the 37 sports at Stanford, they're subject to an overall budget constraint by adding them all up. That would be similar to a rule that said, gee, the San Francisco Giants, the Golden State Warriors, and the Sharks, we're going to add up all their salaries and cap it. So every additional dollar paid to the 49ers, you have to take away $1 from the Sharks. All right? That, of course, is something that is extremely controversial. And finally, there's the part that hurts Stanford, which is in defining how much additionally schools could spend. They said you can increase the number of scholarships you have by $2.5 million. But $2.5 million means something very different at Stanford than at Brigham Young, where tuition is $4,800 and Stanford is $60,000. So Stanford can have 1/3 as many incremental scholarships as BYU, or 1/4 as many. So that is where we stand right now. The House settlement has not been approved. There's a hearing about it scheduled in April. There's over 100 objections to it, many of which are coming from walk-on athletes in sports because they've cut the roster allowed for walk-ons. So a lot of walk-ons are going to lose the ability to play intercollegiate sports if the House settlement isn't stopped.
So one other thing I thought was true, and I think is true, is that part of the House settlement has payments for players of the last 10 years, totaling $2.8 billion that in back pay, if you want to call it that. So that'll be interesting. Naya, I want to turn to you. You were a member of the plaintiffs in this, and this settlement, I presume, is kind of a compromise between the plaintiffs and the NCAA. How satisfied are you with the settlement?
Yeah, I would just like to preface by saying, like, since I am still involved in the case and it's still pending, there are some things that I can't fully share. But I will say the main reason why I wanted to be a plaintiff in this settlement is just to, one, represent Olympic athletes and show that you guys can speak up if you feel like you have any grievances. I think one of the main things we experience on a day-to-day basis are like a lot of like daily complaints, especially being a student athlete at Stanford. There are a lot of challenges that come with that. And honestly, it does feel like a job. It feels like more than a full-time job. And just hearing those complaints or like experiences from my teammates, from people from other sports, I feel like being a face and representing those Olympic athletes is something that I want to do just to advocate on our behalf. Now, thank you. Thank you. I will say with a $2.8 billion settlement, it does seem like a little bit of a Band-Aid when you just like are like, hey, we'll pay you guys and like, that's it. Obviously, that's amazing. I love that I got paid for this, so very happy about that. But I will say I feel like this is just one step. Obviously, right now, the settlement is not perfect. As you guys heard earlier, I was a bioengineer here. I'm a big curious person. I love criticizing things and questioning things. So the bunch of objectives that we've been hearing from several groups, I ask the lawyers about those on a daily basis. I'm questioning. I'm like, hey, I want to make sure that the class that I'm representing, they're not negatively impacted. And I'm very honest with them. Like, I want this to be the best situation for us all. Especially since my younger sister is actually going to be an incoming freshman here on the soccer team as well. So I do not want to put her in a situation that would be negatively impacted by this settlement. I will say that's a good step in the right direction in terms of compensating athletes, but there's still a lot more that needs to be done.
Tara, obviously you were a brilliant coach for a long time, but and you know, the last time she won the Pac-12 Coach of the Year was last year. But the question is, how different would it be to be a coach now with all these changes? And how different would recruiting be with all these changes, particularly the transfer portal? You know, in the past, you more or less knew who 2/3 or 3/4 of your team was going to be next year. Now you know nothing about next year's team.
Well, John, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here and have an opportunity to talk to all of you. I love coaching at Stanford. We didn't win championships, and I wasn't Coach of the Year because I'm brilliant. We had great players. And the fact that Stanford recruited the type of players that could be really successful because they wanted great education, the combination of a great education and great athletics. What's now kind of the third pillar of recruiting is the payment directly to the players. First, it was Alston money, which Roger referenced Alston, and Stanford was slow to offer Alston money, which is another court case against the NCAA, which the NCAA lost. But beyond that, now a young player that is a women's basketball player or a male football player or a male basketball player, it's not just coming to Stanford to get an education or any school to get an education and have an opportunity to play on an athletic team, but also payment, either this year from a collective or in the future if there's revenue sharing at the universities. And right now, it's kind of the Wild West where there's a lot of behind-the-scenes curtain, like someone will say, well, this person's getting $100,000. No, it's $200,000 or $300,000. It's really hard to figure this out. And We have been supported by the Lifetime Cardinal, which some people are here, part of Lifetime Cardinal, and we're very thankful for that, because otherwise we would not be able to recruit and retain the caliber athletes that you need to have to be successful. On top of that, obviously, we had conference realignment, which we're now in the ACC, All Coast Conference, and but it's very challenging. You know, Kate Pay, who graduated from Stanford, is the head coach now, Stanford undergrad, Stanford Law School and Business School. So she is doing a great job, but it's very challenging. They get home from a trip at 3:10 in the morning, coming from the East Coast. So there's big challenges, and I'm hoping that people on, you know, this, with our leadership at our university, will have some answers to kind of really stabilize the situation. But it's a very challenging time. The landscape of athletics has just gone haywire. It's topsy-turvy.
Andrew, it's great to have you at Stanford again. And I'm going to ask you a two-part question, but they're probably related. One is, how can Stanford football cope with all these changes, including the transfer portal and the NIL and the ACC? But also, can you describe your job? Now, I take it your job has a lot to do with this, but it has to do with more than this.
Yeah, appreciate it. I usually forget one question in a double-barreled question, so forgive me if I ask it again. And echoing Tara, it's awesome to be here. What is my job? My title is the general manager of football. What is different from every other general manager in college football is that I sit on top of football, not underneath the head coach. And if you're a college football fan, you know that college football story is coupled with a cult of coach, Bear Bryant, Nick Saban, right? This is college football. So President Levin, I think, astutely observed towards the end of the previous season that the stuff piling up on the head coach's plate was getting to a point that was untenable. And it's part of why Nick Saban left. It's part of why you've seen, you know, many basketball coaches leave, you know, the industry in college. Yeah, Tara raises her hand. She can speak to it. All right, so we had a conversation. She asked me to come and basically take the CEO stuff off of the head coach's plate and let the head coach be a head coach, do what he's supposed to do, X's and O's, go win football games. So I think I would describe my role as, yes, general manager. It deals with personnel, who's on our team, how we're going to allocate resources, who we're going to recruit, how we're going to sell this place, who we need to retain, right? There's a level of strategy there. And then it's a very forward-facing role, and it's fundraising, right? It's I feel like a bit of an evangelical preacher in like the 1880s, like barnstorming and proselytizing and evangelizing and getting people fired up about Stanford football. Certainly there's a level, politics maybe is the right way to describe it. College, Stanford football sits at the intersection of, you know, college football in America, which is its own unique culture. And, you know, one foot is in Stanford's ecosystem, which has its own rules in many ways. And so trying to make sure, you know, that we're waiting and going the right direction. So CEO, director, GM, whatever, it's sort of an amalgamation of all of those things. But what is unique is that I get to sit on top of football and have all the power. Which has been fun. And I was curious how our head coach was going to receive the news when it happened, right? And I walked into his office at the end of the season, and he was relieved. It's too much. You can't, you know, negotiating with, and like what a bizarre world it is to negotiate with parents over X dollars on like Christmas Eve during a transfer portal, you know, for their son to transfer to your school. It is that world. How will Stanford be successful, I think, was the first part of the question.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
And look, President Levin did not hire me to usher our football program into the West Coast Conference and drop down to FCS, right? I mean, his hire of me was a real commitment from our administration and an understanding that football matters in this country, and big-time football matters to Stanford's brand, to this university, to our community, to how we celebrate, to how we connect. So one, I think we're going to be successful because we have an administration, President Levin and Provost Martinez, that understand that. That excites me. Two, we will have to be competitive in the NIL revenue share world, however you want to call it, because that's proxy for are you serious about this endeavor. And I know when I think about myself as a 16, 17-year-old recruit, I wanted to go to Stanford. One, Jim Harbaugh was there. He was an infectious recruiter. But I knew Jim Plunkett played there. I knew John Elway played there. I knew Steve Stenstrom, Chad Hutchinson, Todd Husak, Trent Edwards. I knew I could go there and play at the highest level of football, develop to do what I wanted to do, my dream, play quarterback in the NFL, and go to the best school in the world, meet the most interesting people in the world. I regret not ever taking a class of yours. It's like a famous.
It's not too late.
No, is it not? I thought you were done. So, Professor Noll's a famous figure in our household because my dad was an athletic director in sports business in different places, and he would always reference this Roger Noll guy who's writing about paying college athletes. But when Stanford shows and signals it's serious about something, we're totally paradigm busting. And there are enough bright kids that are really tough, good football players, and I think Tara would say the same about basketball. I think say the same about any other sport, that you just got to make sure when you're recruiting, you land those kids. You can't miss out on too many of them because the athletic chops are a drop off, but the academic chops are a steep, steep drop. So I know those kids are out there in high school and in the transfer portal. I saw that in my experience. And we are signaling to the country, to the landscape, that we are serious about this. There are certainly steps to take. The kids are there, and we're going to get them, and we're going to win. And like Tara said, it's about the players on the field. Absolutely. So that is my snap answer of how we're going to win. Because I've heard from a few of you already that President Levin made a pretty simple direct remark about sports and football, and that football has to just win, baby. So we're, in the words of Al Davis, we're just gonna win, baby. Thanks.
All right. Let me mention to the panelists, if I ask a question of one person and somebody else wants to chime in, that's fine. A conversation would be fine. But Gene, I was going to get to you, and Stanford has been a fairly famous feeder school for the Olympics, and Cal too, for that matter. And I just want to get your sense, is that in jeopardy with all these changes, and particularly in the sort of non-money sports? Or what's your perspective on how the U.S. Olympic team is affected by what's going on in college athletics?
So thank you very much for including me on the panel. I also serve in the role as the chair of the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee. So I see all of Team USA, both Olympic and Paralympic athletes, in summer and winter. So I have a chance to see the whole picture. And you have to recognize Stanford is the most effective factory for Olympic and Paralympic athletes in the world. And it's not just unparalleled in creating athletes for Team USA, but athletes who play in other teams around the world. This is the best place in the world. If you're an intelligent kid who wants a great education, but you have the talent to play Olympic-level sports in many, many sports, Stanford is a place to come. And people know it. And in order to support that, we have to have an effective system that doesn't drain money from Stanford's budget so egregiously that it's very, very hard to support. And given what's been happening with the combination of NIL, the collectives, conference realignment, the transfer portal, and now the revenue sharing that will come in the wake of the House settlement, that's a very hard thing to do. And so what we at the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee want is to make sure that we're raising our hand and saying, the consequence of all of this, if we don't think about it, is that schools that suddenly have expenses they never had before, for revenue sharing, for example, will have to reduce the rosters or reduce the sports in the Olympic programs. And we'll have fewer Olympic athletes that are created in the best system in the world for developing Olympic athletes, which is the NCAA, a collegiate athletic system. So we have a lot at stake here. And it's not just for American athletes, it's for athletes all around the world. So I was on the Stanford board for 2 terms and lived through the, taking the 11 sports out, getting the 11 sports back. That process was eye-opening for the leadership at Stanford. And I think it took a little bit of time. But the point I would make to all of us is sports is so important to people today. It is It is one thing in the world that is really unifying, that brings people together, that causes people to be with each other in spite of whatever other differences they might have. It's more powerful than it's ever been. It's more meaningful than it's ever been. And to have that at Stanford as one of the treasured assets and attributes of the university is one of the rarest qualities in the world, especially when it's also part of the best university in the world. So we have at Stanford an enormous obligation, honestly, to make sure we do what we can to take advantage of that, and also lead the rest of the country in addressing this system, because we're at risk of losing what's made our Olympic system work in this country through the colleges.
Naya, you mentioned your sister's going to be a freshman on the soccer team.
Yes.
And you were a freshman, I think, in 2021.
Yes, I was.
How different will it be to be a freshman in 2025 or 6 with your sister compared to what it was just 5 years earlier?
Yeah, I would say the main thing, her having to travel to the East Coast for 4 years. I mean, for me, I was very lucky that I just graduated this past December, so this past quarter was my last one at Stanford, and I was having fun taking like drawing and doing all those little fun classes and stuff. I was like, yeah, I can draw while I'm in Florida. Like, I'm cool doing that. But my younger sister, she's thinking of doing product design here on the mechanical manufacturing track or something like that. I don't know. She likes doing all that. And I can't imagine her doing that while being in the ACC. I've been trying to prepare her for that and just being like, hey, like, this is what you need to do. Make sure you use all your resources, all that stuff. But there's a big difference in playing in the Pac-12 for the 3 years I did to the ACC than for her having to be in the ACC for her 4 years. So I would say that's the biggest thing. And then also, too, the growth of NIL, I think, has been huge throughout my 4 years here. I've been very lucky to be able to benefit from some NIL deals in my Stanford career, but now I think there's been a great investment in women's sports. And for those people here, I'm not big into economics or something, but if you guys are investing, invest in women's sports while you're at it, because it's going to be big. I'm going to put it out there right now. Invest in your women's sports. But yeah, I've seen a big growth in women's sports and the amount of companies and brands that are looking for female athletes. So I think that's also like a positive thing moving forward. But I think the main thing is conference realignment for her.
Can I follow up on one thing?
Absolutely.
There are two things I think we said. I'm taking my football GM hat off, but I was at the farmer's market close by last year. Caitlin Clark was still playing for Iowa and taking the coverage. And there were little boys wearing Caitlin Clark Iowa 22 jerseys walking around. And I have two daughters, and we watch sports on TV. And there are women's sports on TV at a scale that did not exist certainly when I was growing up. And I know growing up in Houston, no boys were walking around in Sheryl Swoop's Houston Comets jerseys. Right? There's been an incredible paradigm shift that is awesome and sort of related, I think, to Gene. And we've discussed this before in a question. I've heard someone in jest say, the best thing for Stanford would be if the Olympics were every year, right? Like we would just dominate sports news because we'd have so. And the reality is they're not. But I think we got some numbers after this past Paris Olympics, and that Stanford had an earned media value through the duration of the Olympics in the high 200 million, so like 260, 70, 80 million earned media value. For context, I want to say through the course of a season, an NBA franchise, sort of an average one, will be around 200 million, right? So there was an incredible attention on Stanford athletes, and I think a massive nut to crack is, okay, then how do you actually manifest dollars out of that to support Stanford Olympic sports? I think that's a really thorny, sticky, fun subject for us as an athletic department. And what is so unique about our athletic department is that we do have 36 sports, and we do demand that the majority of them go win a national championship every 5 years. And we play big-time football. And it's not so long ago that we were playing Wisconsin in a Rose Bowl and beating up on sort of the traditional Blue Buds. So that's it's a little bit of, we got to have it all and got to have it all right now, but it's also part of why it makes sense for Stanford to have a GM sitting on football with the breadth of sports, and what makes it fun trying to figure this out and how we honor and hold up a commitment across a broad breadth of sports.
John, can I
Sure.
jump in? For the time that I've been at Stanford, since 1985. I mean, I've watched football kind of do a little bit of this and that and then way up, and obviously, Andrew, when you were here, it was great. I think the thing that's really different now is the amount of money that's involved with recruiting and retaining football players, men's basketball players, women's basketball players, and it is seeping down into all sports. So how do we maintain in a fair way, and where does Title IX fit into the conversation with, as an example, to retain the best quarterback? If we were recruiting you again now, what would it cost Stanford? Maybe just a hypothetical.
A couple million.
Okay, so are you comfortable as a professor to have Andrew in your class making $3 million? And a couple. I went up to 3.
No, that's great.
I know.
And if you give him a B, he can go on strike.
And then he wants to transfer because you gave him a B.
In my class, tipping is allowed 10%.
But you're in the same classroom with Naya's sister after you came back, and she's not in that $1 million range. And so how is it fair for athletes? How is it fair for where does it go? And is it sustainable? Playing on the East Coast.
Bear in mind, though, that keep the cart before the horse. What's driving the costs is the revenue. All right? Since 1995, the average annual rate of growth in revenue from football has been 8% per year. All right?
That's pretty good, isn't it?
That is really good, right? And the value of a Stanford football scholarship, maybe it'll be different next year when things change about NILs and Alston money and all that. But the average annual rate of growth in the value of a Stanford football scholarship has been about 1/3 of that. So you have to bear in mind the reason for all this litigation and the reason for all this disruption is that the profit margin over what you have to pay the players has grown astronomically. And the main beneficiaries of that are men's basketball and football coaches, whose, the salary of a Big Ten or SEC coach who is in the running to win the conference championship has gone from the low hundreds of thousands of dollars in the year 2000 to 15 million now. That's what's driving all this. And so the increment thus far in the expenditures on football scholarships are tiny compared to the increments in men's basketball and football coaching staff. Now, I also want to point out that this is not just going to be football and men's basketball. Tara won my Coach of the Year award the year she fought the NCAA on the discriminatory treatment of women versus men in the NCAA basketball tournament. The explanation always was what's called there's even a litigation term for this. It's called the market defense. That who cares about women's basketball? Of course we don't pay them anything. Of course we don't let them have good practice facilities. Of course we make them stay in worse hotels than the men. But the reality is we're on the cusp of women's sport becoming extremely popular despite the lack of interest in the NCAA in promoting it. And we're very likely to see in the next 10 years, one of the disrupting factors about the future of college sports, the same thing, the same tension between growth of revenue and caps on spending and rising coaching salaries, and you deserve it, Tara, is that same tension is now going to happen in women's sports. It's going to happen in softball. It's going to happen in volleyball. It's going to happen in soccer. Because they are the sports that are going to experience this rapid growth in the next 15 to 20 years.
Let me, Tara, I'm going to get back to you if you have more thoughts about Title IX in a minute. Roger, I wanted to ask you, though, does it really make sense, and Andrew, you could weigh in on this too, does it make sense that the league structure be the same for football and softball and soccer and
That's a softball pitch.
No, but
of course not.
So why are we in the ACC in all these sports?
And the it would make enormous good sense for, let's get back to Kate Pay's problem. I also play pickup basketball with Kate Pay too, so. The men's and women's basketball team in the winter quarter spend 4 of the 10 weeks on the East Coast. How can you be a Stanford student and spend 4 of the 10 weeks on the East Coast? Because the ACC schedule, you play on Wednesday and Sunday. That shoots the week. And you can't sort of fly back in each direction in the middle of this period. So what John says is right even beyond that. The economic and psychological irrationality of having a West Coast team play on an East Coast conference is true for everything. It's true of basketball as well. So the sensible thing for Stanford to have done was different. But this, we shouldn't focus too much on Stanford because we're so unique. Only at Stanford would the audience understand that there's a problem when I say they're going to be away 4 weeks out of 10. No, most other places they wouldn't be so, oh, great, man, go, play some video games. I don't care. But that is the fundamental problem, is that the trade-offs about geography versus lots of money from media were not adequately taken into account. And it's more understandable at some other schools than it is at Stanford.
Andrew, to put a point on it, does it make sense for the baseball team to be in the same league as the football team?
There's so many compelling reasons, I think, and I'm curious where this goes, of how much more does football begin to untether itself from the traditional model of college sports. And I think when you're reframing the title of the panel to the present and future of college sports, I think this is a major question. Football's obviously been the economic engine for things for a long, long time, and it's a bit of the perversity right now, right? In a lot of ways. So I'm curious where this goes. I for one, am so excited for the House settlement because a level of sanity does need to come to the system. But I don't think we're under any impression that this is, it's going to be like this for perpetuity starting April 8th after this is done, hopefully. I think Gene and I were speaking before the panel on what are the different threads you might pull into the future. Where does this go? I was a union member in the NFL. I see no problem with a collective bargaining agreement eventually being in place. Men's and women's basketball, I think, is the interesting one. And, where does that fit into whole things? Can you divorce football completely? Does geographic logic need to rule the day for sports, or can football exist separately? Because the football travel problem, it's tough to go to the East Coast and play, but our guys will miss maybe 1 or 2 more days of an afternoon of class than they would have in the Pac-12, right? And it's not a problem. So, and then federal legislation would be the other, the other topic I think would be that will be pertinent to this whole thing. And the TV deals for the Big Ten and the SEC are up in 2028, 2029. We saw big news out of the Big 12 today that private equity has made its way in at the conference level. We'll see if athletic departments start to accept private equity money. I think that's a big Rubicon. But I'd love to hear Gene's thoughts on this as well, beyond football.
So the source of this issue, maybe this dysfunction, is the fact that there's media value associated with college football that overwhelms everything else in college sports. And there will be more value coming from basketball than women's basketball and then many of the other women's sports over time. But today, 85 or 90% of the value is in football, college football. And yet, it's not actually that good at generating media value relative to how popular it has been. If you think about it, the NFL generates something in the range of $13 to $14 billion in media revenue every year with 32 teams. All of college football, including the CFP, it's somewhere over $4 billion. And ask yourself the question, do you think that all of college football is worth that fraction of the media value of the NFL? Probably not. And part of the problem has been the conferences have played in certain historic patterns, which mean it wasn't that easy to get the teams that people wanted to see play against each other. That's honestly what's led to conference realignment. And the two big media players that affect college football are ESPN, which is a principal programmer for the SEC, and Fox, which is a principal programmer for the Big Ten. And what we're seeing is 85% of the revenue flows through those two organizations, and most of it goes right to those two conferences. And within both those conferences, you have some teams like Georgia and Ohio State that have made football a real business. And they've approached it like a business, and they actually make money in their athletics departments. And we think maybe of the Division I schools, there could be a dozen who make money, and almost everybody else is lucky to break even. Most lose money before the House settlement. So if you add revenue share costs on top of that, almost the entire Division I will be in a money-losing position. That's the dilemma. So you have to think through the whole system to figure out what's the answer. And there's no reason that college football and all of the other sports have to be in the same conferences. There really is no reason, except they got dragged into it because the decision makers are all organized by conference. And the way the media agreements run is through the media companies to the conferences. So a big rethink is necessary. We're not quite ready to have that happen yet. And I would actually say, this sounds like Jamie Dimon, the pain hasn't been bad enough that people are forced to make the changes. We're beginning to see it. Traveling to the East Coast when you go to Stanford is painful. But when we see that many universities have to start cutting sports or reducing rosters, and that creates 2 or 3 years of real disarray, I think we'll ask questions about, have we done this the right way? Is there a better way to do it? And then I think people have to get creative.
You actually anticipated my question, Gene, and that I was going to ask you about inequality across teams, but you've pretty much said it. But even within a league, right? Ohio State and, I don't know, Vanderbilt or whatever. I mean,
Purdue.
Yeah,
Ohio
different.
State and Purdue,
Yeah.
and Georgia and Vanderbilt. And if you said, okay, those are the two contrasts, the irony is within the Big Ten and the SEC, there is a have and a have-not.
Yep.
And not everybody is going to do the same program as Georgia and the SEC, and obviously not everybody is going to be Ohio State.
Tara, I was going to give you a chance. Title IX is, 50 years old now. The goal is gender equality in college sports. I'm not sure we've completely achieved that goal. Maybe we've made progress. What direction is it going now? Is it going in the right direction, or is it getting worse?
Well, I think Gene would probably agree. Title IX is the reason that American athletics for women has dominated the world, basically, in all the Olympics. And because of the support that our athletes are given with coaching and all the resources that they're given. In the current landscape, I think it is challenging to figure out how Title IX fits into the fairness picture of, again, I'm one of 5 children, and my mom and dad, when we sat down to dinner, it wasn't steak for the boys and hot dogs for the girls. I mean, if we had steak, we had steak. If we had hot dogs, we had hot dogs. And that's the thing, wanting to have a great, to have a football program is going to cost a lot of money at any place, whether it's Stanford or any other place. And so we have limited amount of resources, so how are the resources divided up? And I think part of the issue with women's sports, and Roger kind of talked about the growth and where we're at, we haven't been at the business as long as men have, but in the last television, NCAA television viewership ratings, women's basketball tournament outdrew the men's basketball tournament for the first time in history. There were over 18 million people, 19 million people, which is good for women's basketball, but in some ways is bad for men's basketball. But women's sports are on the move, and they are growing. And some of it is not, if you don't have the money to support the marketing and the promotion and the scholarships for women's sports, they will die on the vine. And it's a very challenging situation. You know, I work at Stanford, and I love Stanford, and I loved it when Andrew was playing, and the football stadium's full, and I know that that's kind of the engine of the train, but it can't take all the resources where then, you know, Naya's sister is in, you know, not able to participate and really enjoy her experience either. So we do have a very big challenge. And one thing, I don't ever want to correct you, Roger, but it's 5 weekends on the road. So you have 4 trips plus the fifth with the tournament.
4 weeks, 5 weekends.
And it's not just Stanford that has to do this. If you're an athlete at any West Coast school, UCLA, USC, Arizona, Arizona State, Washington, not Washington State, but Oregon, those athletes are playing in the Big Ten. They're going to Maryland, and their weekends, they play Sunday through Wednesday, so they get back Thursday morning, and you know they're not going to class on Friday, so that's bad for them too.
So let me ask one more question, because the audience is going to want to weigh in. And I was going to ask it to Naya and Andrew. You both were great majors, bioengineering, architecture, engineering. Doesn't this transfer portal make it hard to have a serious academic experience?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I feel like, Andrew, you might be better with the transfer portal than me. I feel like in women's soccer, the main reason why the transfer portal becomes an issue is not really because of like getting compensated more. Like in football, they're like, I'm gonna get paid a couple like $1,000,000 or $100,000 more if I go to this school. That's not the case for us. Usually it's because it's mistreatment from coaches, coaching staff, bad experiences, mental health problems, Title IX issues, things like that. That's the main reason why it's in effect for women's sports, I'd say, and that's just in my experience and hearing things, but I think Andrew would have a better answer in terms of the football perspective on the transfer portal.
Let's let Andrew weigh in first.
What? I think Roger said at the beginning, all the litigation in the NCAA, the education's a moot point in all the changes right now. I'm curious if we get to a system where that's sort of reintegrated as a forcing factor, a positive one. I think at Stanford, we are different. We'll uphold our academic integrity in everything that we do. But yeah, if you transfer 4 times in 4 years, you're not having an educational experience worth writing home about. And you know what? And I'll be honest, for some, if you're making life-changing money through that process and weren't gonna have an educational experience that set you up for any sort of positive trajectory in life, I don't have a problem with it. Just, you know, Stanford's not going to be a part of that journey.
Just one thing.
Okay, one quick.
Yeah.
Hey, Roger's going to weigh in, and then we're going to get to the audience.
The transfer portal is one of the things that'll bring the next antitrust suit, because the transfer portal has 2 features of it that are there simply for the benefit of the school at the cost of the students. The first is the narrowness of the window, which, as I think Andrew mentioned, this year it was December 15th to January 6th.
Yeah, and then again in April.
And then
Don't
again,
open it up anymore. Don't advocate
No,
for that,
no,
Roger.
no,
it
I'm
was
just saying.
miserable.
I'm not advocating anything.
Okay, good.
I'm saying, what's the next antitrust case? It is limitation of the window, and once you declare you're in the window, you lose your scholarship at the university you're at. All right, those are both going to be the subject of the next litigation, regardless of how the House settlement decision goes.
Okay, it's your turn, the audience. I'm going to ask Colleen Cahill to recognize you. I already told you I have terrible vision. I couldn't tell if your hand's up or down. So Colleen is the new development officer at SIEPR. She's fantastic, and you need to get to know her.
Hi, I'm Janine Zaccaria. I teach in the Department of Communication. I've been here about 13 years. And I just want to say, as someone who's in sort of the trenches with the students, who has many athletes in my classes, in this quarter in particular, I have a lot of women athletes, including a star soccer player, a softball player and stuff, that we cannot overstate how straining and draining and difficult and impossible this is for these students to have to keep up with their coursework, travel, coach, sometimes connecting to get to North Carolina. I mean, the fact that, it is really difficult for me, someone who cares so deeply about my students, to watch them struggle with this. And I think it's very important for Stanford to evaluate the physical toll and the mental toll it's taking on the student athletes right now. We're talking about it like commodities. This is a business panel, but I just wanted to make that point. Also, Tara, I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about the transfer portal and how much that impacts one's ability to build a team when you never know whether another collective is going to pay someone like a Kiki Arioff enough money to draw her away. Thanks.
Well, the transfer portal is different, and I transferred as a college athlete, but I wasn't really a good athlete, so no one was recruiting me or giving me money. But I think it definitely changes the dynamic on a team, and that, but the players on the team seem to accept it in a different way than maybe the coaches do. We had a young lady on our team who graduated from Stanford, and during the season was being talked to by the other team, which I think would be tampering in the NFL, right? So there was tampering, and a deal was made with her dad, and she was, she cried to talk to me about it, that she had to go through this. But I think players should have the opportunity to go and play where they want to play, and play for the coach they want to play, and get the education they want to get. But there are players. I watched a game last night. There was a player that had been at 4 different places in 4 years. And that does not seem to be conducive to a great education for the young people. But the portal, the combination of no rules, the portal, and money, and outside forces working with no tampering is a problem.
I think my question is whether or not it's the litigation that has made the pendulum swing so far. So I was a college athlete at another Bay Area college that will go unnamed in this building, where academics is also important, and it's really hard to travel, I'm sure, across the country. But at that time, if we were to try to transfer, you had to sit out a year, which at that time was unfair. But now we've made it where people can transfer literally every year and have no consequence. We went from no compensation at all to now, right, having athletes be recruited for millions of dollars. And I spent a year working in enforcement at the NCAA. And so I know what that meant when the sanctions were coming down for recruiting violations. Is it just the litigation that has pushed it to an extreme, or do we think it's something else?
Let me just briefly give a partial answer. The litigation is an effect, not a cause. The cause is the NCAA's rulemaking process being too ossified over the past 30 years to sort of realize the changes that are going on and how they had to adjust their own policy. And that's been true not only about things having to do with how much, with athletes and transfers and compensation, it's also true in terms of implementation of Title IX. It's also true about taking commercial advantages of sports other than football and men's basketball. It's just an entity that has not been good at recognizing the changed circumstances in the environment in which it operates and changing its operations to deal with that in a way that could have avoided a significant fraction of the antitrust cases against it.
More questions? Questions, not statements.
Hi, I'm a member actually of the Stanford marching band.
Yeah.
So I have, thank you. So I have gone to, I was actually at Coach VanDerveer, I was at your record-winning game. I was at every single football game last quarter. So also, Mr. Luck, thank you for going to those games. But I've seen, like, there are times like the record-breaking game where we have the student body who's really active and really invested and really enjoying being there. But I've also, like the Louisville game that we won, without fail, half the student body in the student section left by halftime. So I think, like, with this discussion, I think as we have confidence realignment, how do you feel we can make sure that there is, within the rest of the student population of non-athletes, there's that continued interest and investment in wanting to go to these games and wanting to be there and support our fellow students who are playing so hard to represent our university?
Andrew, you probably.
Absolutely. I mean, if you're in band, there's definitely a screw loose somewhere. So I know you're a cool dude. I'm a fan. I had a lot of friends in band. They were fun to hang out with. I know that. I'll start somewhere. One, I think college football, college sports are so, they're such a fantastic part of the experience of going to school in America and college. I think that is something that is really endears itself to people's psyches and souls, right? Going to college basketball, going to the Cal Stanford basketball game last week had me all fired up. That was fun. It was fun to experience collective effervescence with a community, and I think that's very important. I think it borders on religion in many ways, especially more fervent in other parts of the country. I know in my perch as GM, I think a lot about how we make sure, well, one, everybody loves a winner. I know we want people in our stadium, we got to win. Like there is a simple equation there. I also want to make sure that our local communities know that showing up to football games 6 Saturdays a year in the fall should just be a ritual. It should be a given. It should be what you do. In the winter, it should be, hey, your Wednesdays and Thursday nights, and then your Saturdays and Sundays, there's going to be a basketball game on campus. I think we have a major campaign to sort of ritualize and internalize that amongst all of our local communities. And I do at its best what I believe sports can give, to echo what Gene shared. And certainly Gene and I, we got to hang out at the Olympics in Paris this past year, and to see the sort of collective effervescence on an international stage was really astounding. But like college sports, at its best, that's what it does. It brings people together. It helps people celebrate. I mean, I think there's a very healthy thing to like boo and cuss a little bit at a referee on a Wednesday night basketball game. Like I'd rather blow steam off that way than other ways. So that's part of my goal as the GM of the football team, is to give our student body, our professors, our faculty, our admin, our staff, something to bring each other together with, and go yell and cheer. And I want to see the 4 largest gatherings in the history of Stanford amongst alumni were Rose Bowl in 2000, Rose Bowl in 2012, Rose Bowl in 2013, Rose Bowl in 2015, right? Orange Bowl maybe the year before that as well, Jesse. So, that is a goal of ours, and we think about that every day. Yeah.
I'm just wondering, the talk about the money from various sources to the student athletes. Which athletes? Is it just the star? I mean, I'm wondering the impact on the team as a whole. Is it just the quarterback? And what does that defensive end think? Or is it just the highest scorekeeper maker in the soccer? I worry about the feelings amongst the team, how this can impact people. And maybe that's spread throughout the whole team. I just don't know.
I'll start with this as well, if you don't mind. It's a great question. I was curious about this as well. I played professional sports where there were some of us on the team that made a whole lot more than others on the team, and it's just accepted, right? And when it lines up with value to the team and how well you are, everybody accepts it and moves on, and if not, then you might have some culture problems. I can tell you on the Stanford team this year, there were some young men making hundreds of thousands of dollars, and there were some young men that were walk-ons and not making anything. And that had no negative bearing on locker room culture at all. It really didn't. I can't speak for any other sport. Now, if we're, and I wasn't around last year, but I can say moving forward, as a GM, as we're allocating capital and revenue and sharing and how you construct a roster, you absolutely have to take into consideration a number of factors. But if you're not optimizing to win football games, right, then I think you miss out on the essence of doing it to a certain degree. Now, we do here at Stanford, I do hold very dearly the development of a whole young man as they come in here, their academic journey, their athletic journey, their social journey to be important. And I can say the highest paid players on the Stanford team last year, the singular highest paid player just went to the NFL, and he had a 3.96 in computer science and has two quarters left in school, and he's going to come back and graduate when it works for him. So, it won't ruin sort of locker room culture. I think if it's done right, it won't ruin that.
There's one other point. Most college sports are called equivalency sports, which means you can give partial scholarships. The vast majority of sports at Stanford, you have teams that have some players with full scholarships that go $5,000 above cost of attendance. You have other players playing for 25% of cost of attendance, and it doesn't bother them.
I'd like to ask a question about how viable do you think the NCAA is as a durable organization?
I guess any of us can take a crack at that, right? So you may get 5 different opinions. First of all, the NCAA has been through a difficult, I don't know, couple decades where their authority has been eroded. But we need something like the NCAA. We have to have some organization that is respected nationally, that has authority. There needs to be consistency. So not having an NCAA that has authority, I think, has been very unfortunate. So I can't tell you exactly how we get there. We're going to see potentially national legislation that will set some guardrails on some of these things that are changing. We will be better off if the NCAA is more effective. The leader of the NCAA, who's the former governor of Massachusetts, he took the job recognizing how much had been eroded in their authority and also recognizing how much the job was about having a relationship with political decision makers in the country who had to think about where this was ultimately going to go.
I've got a question for you, Gene, after that. I've been following the U.S. soccer conversation with NCAA soccer and changing the season to a year-round season. And this is the first public example of a national governing body of a singular sport hopping in to help potentially construct what a college soccer player's experience look like. Do you see that as a crossing of the Rubicon, if it does end up happening, where NGBs, including those under the USOPC umbrella, take a more active role in what their collegiate sport sort of looks like?
I wouldn't generalize. The sports are different. The USOPC has 60 different sports. NGB is the acronym for National Governing Body for the Sports. So everything from USA Track and Field to US Soccer, for example. And it really depends on the sport, the nature of the sport, what the sport needs. In some cases, that may be appropriate, especially when the sport's moving into something which has a big professional dimension.
Yeah.
USA Track and Field, it's totally different.
Gotcha.
Because it's a huge sport, but it's got track and field and just all sorts of things that some are essentially highly popular, 100-meter dash, and others are less well known, the javelin throw. And so they don't relate to each other quite as well as some sports where everyone's playing the same game.
Gotcha.
So I would like to declare that this panel has lived up to the name All-Star Team.